to the Monday morning lecture, in which I try to, in accessible fashion, break down some key philosophical and theoretical ideas each and every Monday morning. I'm so glad that you're joining us. This is a global online learning community, and I've been hosting these lectures for the past 2.5 years now, thanks to our patrons who keep this project funded. This is an entirely open access educational project, and I'm just so pleased that you're here with me today. Today, I actually want to deviate from where we were with Hegel to dedicate a special issue of this lecture to talking about Zizek's recent article in Compact, titled "Wokeness is Here to Stay." It's been a very controversial article thus far, for good reason. And so I'd like to dedicate, let's say, 45 minutes to analyzing this article, talking about its more problematic aspects, but also delving into the underlying theory and philosophy that may have gone unnoticed upon first glance. If you're new to this channel, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Each and every lecture can be enjoyed standalone, although if you go into my back catalog, you can find more than 200 lectures that I've uploaded at this point. Is it really? Maybe not 200, more like 150, I'd say. 150? Yeah, 100 plus, let's say it like that. As per usual, if you'd like to download all of my lectures as audio files, plus my ebook, which is called Spurious Infinities, The Cultural Logic of Postmodernism, please consider becoming a patron. After all, this project couldn't exist without the generous support of our patrons. I also host a weekly Q&A seminar after each and every lecture for patrons, which I post as an audio file afterwards. You can find all that and more by going to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Hello, everybody on Instagram. Hello, everybody on YouTube. I'm going to introduce Instagram to YouTube. I seem to have a hair in my face for some reason. Here we have YouTube and Instagram. And as always, if you really want to make me happy, I'd love it if you dropped a comment letting me know where you're joining us from. That is ultimately priceless to me. The fact that you guys can tune in from literally anywhere in the world, it really makes me very happy. So please do leave a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. I'm always very thrilled to feel connected to you in such a fashion. I see someone joining from Brazil, from Vietnam. Guten Morgen Deutschland, bonjour France, Egypt. That's incredible, that's very good. Hello, back to Chicago. It's probably just as cold as it is here. Dubai, hello Dubai. That's wonderful. Indonesia, India, Italy, England, Worcester, Cornwall is beautiful. San Francisco, just got back from California myself. Canada, Chile, India, Germany, good morning, Germany. Nebraska, 82-degree Florida. Copenhagen, I actually have, my brother lives in Copenhagen. India, Pakistan, London, that's where I used to live and work. Malaysia, Bremen, it's amazing. Ukraine, hello Ukraine, hope you're well and safe. Fort Lauderdale, Poland, Tunisia, it's crazy. Thank you guys so much. Pakistan, I could do this for an hour. It means so much to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It is so cool. It is genuinely wild to me that we can connect in this way. I know that might seem naive, but it still gives me butterflies in my stomach. I love that. Goedemorgen Nederland. Okay, so today I want to talk about that Žižek article in Compact, which has ruffled many feathers, understandably. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to not defend it, nor simply explain it, but I'd like to analyze it a little bit. Because underneath the polemics and the, to my mind, unnecessary terminology like trans lobby and the and fighting the woke, etc., which taps into, to my mind, a very reactionary sentiment and conception of wokeness, there are multiple and myriad interesting philosophical and psychoanalytic points that are made and that are in fact quite consistent with Zizek's body of work. And so I suppose we could say, let's start here. What is the article about? The article is called "Wokeness is Here to Stay." And essentially what Žižek is arguing is he's arguing that wokeness presents a kind of dangerous groupthink. And yet, there's a twist. What appears to be a standard right-wing polemic against wokeness is in fact a slightly more nuanced argument about the manner in which wokeism is in fact distinct from liberalism and from leftism. Now, to give a little bit of context here, Žižek has done this before, namely in his critique of political correctness. And so what Žižek is doing here is he's drawing some of his arguments from his critique of political correctness and tapping them in or plugging them into the polemic against wokeness. Now, this in and of itself is not a bad thing. What I find troubling about this article, and I want to say it right off the bat, is the manner in which it identifies trans identity as being part and parcel of wokeness, and the idea of a trans lobby that is secretly conspiring to initiate legislative changes, etc., etc. However, before I get into that, I want to say that this is, to all intents and purposes, not a right-wing or reactionary polemic. And why is that? Essentially, the left-wing critique and the right-wing critique follows a similar form, but has a very different content. The left-wing critique points towards the excessive features that arise within consciousness due to the underlying repressions and contradictions that are imminent to what is known as late capital. Whereas the right-wing critique, or the reactionary polemic, focuses on these excessive and new experiences as being symptoms of a unnatural order. In other words, if you want to put it like this, essentially the right-wing critique posits that there is such a thing as a natural order of quote-unquote true life, and then targets certain deviations from that as signs or symptoms of the decline of civilization. What makes this reactionary is not only that it tends to be anti-liberal and anti-progressive, but that it usually identifies one minority group of people who are then blamed or scapegoated for this supposed decline. Therefore, the right-wing polemical style tends to posit a return to some mythical point of greatness, like Make America Great Again, before society was threatened by conspirators within and without. The leftist critique, on the other hand, while appearing to be the same in content, has a very different form, which is that the leftist critique says that what is known as false consciousness, or in existential terms, mauvaise foi, is a kind of symptomatic emanation, not as a deviation from the natural order which came before, but precisely due to the contradictions of that which lies repressed within the very idea that there is a natural order to begin with. In other words, the return of the repressed, to put it in psychoanalytic terms. Hence why the leftist critique never posits a return to a mythical preordained past. There's no naturalism implicit in the leftist stance. Hence also why certain hippie movements that advocate a return to Earth tend to be secretly reactionary in nature rather than leftist. Instead, the leftist position will always argue for pushing through these contradictions into a new order, which is usually called revolution or utopia. Hence, if you will, we have here the difference in form between a reactionary and a leftist critique. A reactionary critique posits that there is an a priori natural core to society that is being undermined from within and without, whereas the leftist stance tends to point out that there is never a natural order, and the very insistence on such a natural order being under threat is a repression that relies on the, if you will, the disavowal of the manner in which new consciousness is formed. Now, this is very abstract, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that over his career, Žižek has argued against political correctness, against liberalism, even against certain leftist positions, and yet he's never done it from a position of the reactionary right. He's always done it from a radical leftist position. And yet, what is going on with Žižek here? In this article, we seem to have, to all intents and purposes, a capitulation on behalf of Žižek to what is really hard to not term a reactionary stance. The article begins with cherry-picked examples about gender identity and male rapists who identify as women and are put in female prisons and so on and so forth. It's a shockingly unnuanced take on sexual identity and gender. However, once again, even though Žižek is coming out in a rhetorical style that might seem more befitting of Jordan Peterson, in fact, the irony is apparent that Žižek, who was once cast as the antagonist of Peterson, now appears to be pushing the very same rhetorical and polemical buttons that have served Peterson so well in his spheres, that underneath this argument, Žižek is actually making a very consistent case for his critique of sexual identity, which is something that I want to explain in this article, or in this lecture. To put it very simply, Žižek's take on sexual identity is that it doesn't exist a priori or by itself. That sexual identity, rather than being something which one experiences directly or has a feeling for, that sexual identity is in fact the name of a problem, an irredeemable, irresolvable gap or crack within identity as such. And that therefore the very idea that appears within what Žižek terms wokeism, that one can a priori or in advance feel one's sexual identity, or that one doesn't experience the problem of sexual identity in its fullest by means of taking so-called puberty blockers, is therefore problematic. But again, the way in which Žižek presents this problem, to my mind, is unhelpful. It deals not in philosophical clarity, if you will, but instead in polemical abstractions, in a way that, to my mind, is actually a dog whistle for the right, and really unfortunate and unhelpful. And so my first thoughts upon reading this article were, what is going on with Žižek? Are we seeing here the natural decline of a thinker who finds himself increasingly cornered and vilified both by the left and by the right? After all, remember that for many years Žižek maintained that his idea of a successful argument was one that was vilified equally by both the left and the right, because to make a consensual statement was ideologically suspicious. Has Žižek simply become like Hannah Arendt once described Heidegger, a man who had created a burrow for himself that he didn't realize was a trap? I've been thinking about this a bit, and I think that there are certain tendencies that have happened within Žižek's career. I think that he is inclined towards being controversial and outrageous and shocking, that he revels and has a certain pathological satisfaction in being unintelligible to certain people, that there's a certain obscene enjoyment that derives from saying things that are intentionally meant to provoke controversy. And yet, I believe, from looking back at Žižek's work, that fundamentally his conviction is that the participation in polemics, which he says comes at great cost to himself, no surprise, is a form of ethical or moral obligation. In other words, that Žižek believes, at least this is what I think he believes, that his stance against wokeness is in fact part of the necessary continuation of a leftist critique of political correctness. Now, agree with that or not, disagree with that, think of that what you may. There are numerous very interesting points made in the article that have great philosophical insight that I think are worth exploring a little bit more in depth. And that's what I'm going to try to do here in the following half hour. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what is Žižek's definition of wokeness, and how does he relate wokeness to the superego injunction, which is a psychoanalytic term, and then how does he relate this to the argument at the very end of the article that wokeness, rather than being a waking up, is a form of remaining asleep. That's what I'm going to try to do in the next 30 minutes. But I think it is important to say that when one takes apart the argument, as to my mind poorly put as it is, it remains committed to an emancipatory leftist stance. That once you go through the tunnel of what appears to be a right-wing dog whistle, and to many intents and purposes it is in fact the exact opposite. However, I hope that you won't take this as a defense of the article. I still think that there are many ways in which Žižek could have made this argument that would have been more befitting of his cause. But let's pick this apart. Let's analyze this article a little bit more in depth. So I want to begin with Žižek's definition of wokeness, because wokeness is an incredibly abstract, polemical term that often does more damage to my mind, than it is worth. But Zizek's definition of wokeness in this article is that it is essentially to speak from a position of moral authority or moral superiority by which the other can be terrorized. In other words, to take on a moral position by which the other has to, in a sense, fail either to rise up to the bar that is met to him or fail to not rise up to it. I'll give you an example of this that I find quite enjoyable, and it comes from the comedy series Parks and Rec. In fact, in Parks and Rec, we can probably see what is, to my mind, the perfect example of the superego injunction. There's a scene in which the counselors of the Parks and Recreation group have to meet with a Native American man who is trying to build a casino on his land. And they're all in a meeting and they're about to sign the contract. And Leslie, who's the leader of the Parks and Rec organization, she says, "As a sign of our goodwill, I've brought in these ceremonial Native American tribal garb, and we are all going to wear them, and we're going to dance around the table." At that point, one of her coworkers says, "Oh my God, that is clearly totally offensive. Why would you do that?" At this point, the Native American leans over to him and he says, "White man, is that offensive?" Please don't think I'm trying to imitate this. "White man, do you think that is offensive?" And he says, "Oh no, it's not offensive at all." And so he puts on the ceremonial garb, at which point, again, the Native American man looks at him and says, "That is so offensive, you have to take it off." Here we have the double movement of the superego injunction, which is that to not wear the ceremonial garb is offensive, but to take it off is offensive. Now, what's beautiful and emancipatory about this scene, rather than being reactionary, is that it places the power, of course, within the character of the Native American man who is building the casino. He knows perfectly well that his power, which is being denied to him and completely robbed from him, namely the fact that he has to build a casino on what was once rightfully his own land, that this gesture can only be reclaimed not by insisting on having more rights within the American land grabbing system, but precisely by playing around with the superego injunction by which the internalized guilt has become its own form of surplus enjoyment. Now, that's a pretty big statement, so let me try to explain that. Essentially, and this is something I've argued in my book, Žižek has argued in his book, many other people have argued, which is that political correctness, while appearing to be a liberal emancipatory gesture, is actually secretly a form of surplus enjoyment. And surplus enjoyment is an idea that Lacan derives from Marx. Remember, the idea of surplus value is that you derive value from something that has no particular concrete features in the actual objects. For example, surplus value is derived at the level of production when the factory owner derives value that goes above and beyond the labor that was put into the product by the workers. But within a postmodern society, surplus value can be a Balenciaga logo on a t-shirt that makes it infinitely more expensive than a regular cotton t-shirt. And so surplus value is the process by which valuation becomes detached or abstracted from the original concrete form. In fact, it appears to be its very opposite. Rather than the natural qualities of that which something is, it becomes completely attached to that which something is not. The postmodern iteration of this can be found, for example, in the famous Banksy work of art that shredded itself upon the moment of its sale. Here we have the complete negation, or the negation of negation, implicit within the idea of surplus value. That the painting was more valuable when it was shredded than when it was not shredded. That the destruction thereby is a form of shredding. Now, if you go all the way back to I believe it's the line from Hegel, which is, of course, famously associated with the Nazi book burning, which is the idea that wo man Bücher brennt, dann verbrennt man auch Menschen, which is where one burns books, one also burns people. Within the postmodern logic of surplus value and surplus enjoyment, it's not so much to say where you will burn books, you will burn people, but to say where you will burn books, there you will find people. In other words, the surplus enjoyment arises as a kind of like after effect of the very negation of that which was supposed to provide you with pleasure. Now, to go back to political correctness, what we have with Lacan is and Lacan doesn't make this argument, but his argument is about surplus enjoyment, is that, for example, one of the one of the gestures of political correctness is to apologize in advance for your stance. For example, I'm speaking, but I know that I'm speaking as an oppressor, as a colonizer, or as a white man, and so I could never properly understand the experience of what it means to be not white, etc. What appears to be an emancipatory gesture, a gesture of empathy and understanding, is secretly a form of surplus enjoyment because you are affirming your own superiority in advance by means of defacing yourself. Here we can also see the fallacy of the right-wing argument, which you saw, for example, Elon Musk tweeting about the other day when it came to the quote-unquote canceling of the creator of the Dilbert comic, where he said that the media is racist, that by having an emphasis on not having racist creators, comic creators, they're therefore racist because they're not equally engaging with each other. Here you can see the fallacy implicit within the right-wing argument. The properly racist gesture is precisely the idea that one would have to practice this form of equality. Hence, it's also the Ouroboros movement by which the right-wing argument falls apart. On the one hand, they argue against the idea of the affirmative judge, I forget what the name is it affirmative justice? Affirmative justice, where everybody receives and at the same time, they argue for a complete system of meritocracy. And I'm not making the point very well, but what I'm trying to say here is that the surplus enjoyment that is implicit to Lacan is the surplus enjoyment that you experience precisely at putting yourself down apropos the other. And so that thereby the only form of surplus enjoyment that is allowed to the other, for example, the Native American in Parks and Rec, isn't to insist on their power, but precisely to live within this gap, the superego injunction, by which what you do is offensive and by means of what you don't do is also considered offensive. Now we're back at Žižek's argument about wokeness and his definition that wokeness is the attitude by which one embraces a moral position of superiority or authority by which to terrorize the other. Now, Žižek's critique is that wokeness is in fact a form of remaining asleep. What he means is that if wokeness, the participation in the politically correct practices that fall under wokeness, namely the complicit nature by which one feigns to pretend a kind of submissive attitude towards a particular attitude of righteous moral justice, is thereby something which serves the oppressor. That is Žižek's argument. Essentially, Žižek is saying that the entire ethical stance of political correctness and wokeness, which engages in a performative display of liberalism and wanting to appease the other, is thereby precisely a way in which the other is kept in place in a position of impotence, and you remain within your own power. Except now in a particularly devious and, to my mind, postmodern fashion, not only do you get to enjoy being the oppressor, you also get to enjoy being the victim. And so what Žižek is arguing is that wokeness, rather than being a gesture of emancipation, is in fact a way in which the quote-unquote oppressed or the minority remain in that position, whereas those who are woke can tell themselves that they are in fact making some gesture that moves in the right direction. Now, again, I think this argument falls apart a little bit when it comes to Žižek's opening in the article, where he talks about sexual identity. Essentially, what Žižek is arguing is that sexual identity and the emphasis on trans identity in particular is part and parcel of this wokeness and therefore part of the problem. Now, when you read that by itself, of course, this seems to be a simple case of trans bashing, if you will. It seems to be a reactionary polemic against the safeguarding by legislative means or otherwise of people's bodily autonomy. Now, I agree. I think that Žižek is making a poor argument here, but once again, underneath the surface, there is a slightly different argument to be found. Let's go to Žižek's analysis of the LGBTQ plus sequence, which is not in this article, but which he's written about in numerous other books, especially in his books on sexual identity. Essentially, what Žižek argues is that the LGBTQ plus sequence is perfectly suited to postmodern tendencies that emphasize post-political lifestyle choices over collective resistance or action. Essentially, what Žižek is arguing is that identity politics fits within what is known as a post-Marxist approach. However, I should say that post-Marxism is not the same thing as Peterson's reactionary fantasy about postmodern neo-Marxism or the anti-Semitic dog whistle of cultural Marxism. Instead, post-Marxism is a very legitimate field of academic study that is predominantly left-wing. It's a term that was coined by Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. Ernesto Laclau used to be one of Zizek's best academic friends. So Žižek's critique is thereby a critique that is engaged with the difference between what is known as Marxism and post-Marxism. Now, if you're relatively new to this, the difference between Marxism and post-Marxism is that Marxism identifies class consciousness as the central axis by which revolutionary consciousness is found. The moment of class consciousness, thereby, isn't the moment by which the worker has more rights within the given system. In other words, the process by which the worker can work his way up in the incentive structure of capitalism. Instead, the moment of class consciousness is the moment by which one realizes that the working class is not a natural a priori class. In other words, that the working class has no foundational grounding save for being an excessive emanation from within the contradictions that are implicit to capitalism and the capitalist mode of production itself. In other words, the moment of realization within class consciousness isn't we outnumber the elites. It's not a bug's life. It's not saying secretly there's more of us than there are of you. In fact, this has always been a kind of reactionary fantasy, that resistance emerges as a fight from the masses against the elites. When for Marx, the idea of class consciousness is the process by which one realizes that as soon as one refuses to participate in the mode of production by which one is exploited, which is then related back to oneself as one's natural class identity, that the system itself has already changed. That the system, in order to keep on working, relies your casual embrace of the idea that you will no longer be working class. Hence also why when one asks people who are poor, especially in the United States, they don't identify as poor, they identify as on their way to becoming rich. And this process is the process that is antithetical to class consciousness. Thereby, class consciousness is the moment when you realize that you believing that you are on your way to becoming rich is precisely how you will remain never rich. It's also why the quote-unquote secret of the rich is precisely that there is no secret. That the rich are perfectly happy to sell you the idea that there are one or few really hard-working workers who, through individual merit and talent and grit and hardcore hustle culture, were able to work their way up into the elite ranks of high society, because on a structural level, it allows the system to remain as it was. Now, from here, we can take the position from class consciousness within Marxism towards post-Marxism. Post-Marxism does away with this idea that the universal class is the working class. Instead, post-Marxism argues that since we live within a postmodern society in which our identity is no longer simply overdetermined by the relations of capitalist production, that instead the new relations are the relations of the production of ourself. In other words, post-Marxism focuses on the repoliticization of that which was considered outside the universal frame of class consciousness, namely gender identity, feminism, racial identity, post-colonialism. Suddenly we have multiple myriad interdisciplinary ways of emphasizing resistance. Now, on the one hand, this is a good thing. On the one hand, this expands and broadens the horizons of Marxism into a necessary, more modern stance by which we have an intersectional approach towards resistance, which is no longer narrowly defined through the lens of orthodox Marxism and class consciousness. On the other hand, one could make the argument, and certainly some people do, Žižek being one of them, that post-Marxism is simply the idea of Marxism sold back to you through the lens of postmodern iterative functioning, the postmodern iterative functioning of lifestyle choices. And that thereby what happens is that LGBTQ+, which on the surface of it is an entirely emancipatory gesture towards the expression of one's genuine identitarian position and one's gender expression, is in fact part and parcel to the very means by which the universal condition of class consciousness is repressed. And so this is Zizek's argument against LGBTQ+, which is to say that he argues that it is in fact an emanation that arises from within the post-political stance. Now, what is the post-political stance? Essentially, post-politics is a term that emphasizes a move towards individual expression rather than collective stances. This is also why Žižek links post-politics to the Freudian idea of biopolitics. Once you've stopped thinking about society as a kind of overarching collective project by which you have a subjective investment in what is happening, you end up in an individual a narrowing by which your resistance takes place not on the level of the collective, but your resistance takes place on the level of the individual. This can take two forms. This can take a left-wing form. For example, I identify as being countercultural. Now, this can be a little bit weak, like it can be like simply having like a nose ring or some form of like a Che Guevara t-shirt or a Mao wristwatch, right? It can also be a little bit more radical. It can say that you participate in according to different incentive structures, the famous I would prefer not to, that you become an artist rather than a banker, etc. However, fundamentally, this doesn't achieve change. It leads to another form of false consciousness, a kind of infraction by which we now go from the Marxist notion about false consciousness, which was the process of saying, which is taken, of course, from the Bible, for they know not what they do, towards the know that they know exactly what they're doing. Everybody knows that we're complicit, and yet we still keep on doing it because we cannot imagine another world. This is Frederick Jameson's famous injunction that it has become easier to imagine the end of the world than it has become to imagine the end of capitalism. Now, the right-wing version of this is to say, oh, people think that they're such rebels, but actually they're just fakes, and if people, men are no longer real men, and that the problem with society today is that we've lost authentic male adults who are role models for other people. Hereby we go back to the right-wing framing, which is that we have a natural order which through postmodern identities is facing a kind of breakdown from within. To go back to the point I made at the beginning of the lecture, we have here the difference in form between the leftist position and the right-wing position. The leftist position says that the emphasis on identity and individual expression is the ultimate form of resistance, like buy the famous Apple ad, you know, buy an Apple computer because you're resisting the Orwellian system, is thereby the very contradiction and repression that occurs within late capitalism is mirrored on the opposite side of the coin, to mix two metaphors, by the right-wing stance that argues that everything was fine and perfect, except that it's the people with the nose rings who are to blame for everything going to hell, and traditional masculinity has gone away, hence the decline of the nuclear family, and so on and so forth. Fundamentally, these are two responses to a similar trend, which is a transition from the universal idea of resistance within class consciousness towards the postmodern emphasis on identitarian resistance. Now, part of Zizek's critique of LGBTQ+, as I said before, remains nevertheless emancipatory and leftist because he points out that the most important marker in that sequence is precisely the plus. That the plus is a kind of universalized difference. That the plus is supposed to be, if you will, the re-universalization of that which was lost within the post-political. A return to universal consciousness in the kind of sublime in a strict Kantian sense, namely for Kant the sublime was always that which had as its content the impossibility of its content being redeemed with its form. The example that I use in love is to say, I love you so much I couldn't possibly put it into words. Thereby you have a Kantian sublime emanation. You have just put into words the impossibility of putting into words that you are in love. That is what we have with Žižek with the plus. The plus is a sign of universalized difference. Essentially, the plus says we cannot simply have a spurious, infinitely continued sequence of identities that, you know, you can be this and you can be that, you can be that. Then it becomes like shampoo. It becomes like multiple lifestyle choices. Simply take your pick. Instead, the plus is the more radical gesture by which sexual identity itself can never be made to be one thing at one moment. Hence also, to go back to Zizek's article in Compact, his argument is that one of the dangers of wokeism, whereby it becomes radically anti-emancipatory, is that it suggests that one can take one's time to feel out which of those letters is one's sexual identity. In other words, the argument is to say that rather than fixing down identity into a sequence that becomes like an expansion pack upon heteronormative identity, which would, for Žižek would be part of the problem, instead it's the very plus sign which points towards the irredeemable, if you will, the gap or the crack or the glitch in the matrix that lies within identity and sexual identity itself. And so therefore what Žižek is arguing is that what appears as an emancipatory gesture, namely let's add another letter to the LGBT+ sequence, is in fact part and parcel to the very incentive structure within postmodern, post-political, biopolitical existence, which is a masqueraded emancipation that in fact further contributes to the problem. This is what Žižek deems wokeness. Hence also why Žižek argues that wokeness is a particular symptom of postmodern existence or late capital existence, by which what appears to you as the central site of your emancipation is in fact part and parcel to how you remain within the confines and are therefore repressed and exploited. Now, again, I should say that there are ways to make this argument that doesn't rely upon dog whistles like the trans lobby, etc. I find it to be in very poor taste, the way in which Žižek makes this argument. But again, underneath the surface, there are some very interesting arguments to be made. Now, I want to wrap up here by taking Žižek's final argument and taking it apart, because it's the most difficult argument he makes in the article, and it's, to my mind, unnecessarily difficult for this kind of piece. Essentially, the article ends with an elaborate argument about Freudian psychoanalysis, dream analysis, and what wokeness means today. Essentially, Zizek's argument is this: wokeness, rather than waking up, is a form of being asleep. Okay, fair enough. That seems like a great piece of clickbait. It's a little bit like the Andrew Tate saying something like, "The Matrix has me," when he's being arrested under suspicion of sex trafficking, right? This whole idea that you see within the red pill, blue pill movement that, you have to wake up to the Matrix is thereby mirrored by the critique of wokeness as being a form of being asleep. We're stuck, if you will, in what appears to be a binary between being asleep and being awake, which is ironically a perfect postmodern iteration of the classic metaphysical problem posed by Plato about the illusions in the cave versus the world of truth outside. Remember, however, that for Plato, the person who exited the cave never did so by their own volition, but instead was dragged outside kicking and screaming. Back to Žižek. So Žižek uses this argument, which on the surface of it seems unhelpful. Wokeness is a way of being asleep. Wokeness is groupthink. I mean, he doesn't use the word groupthink, but it falls into that same category. But as per usual, there's something much more interesting happening underneath the surface. Žižek is actually making a very radical claim, a distinctly Freudian claim, against the nature of a binary opposition between being awake and being asleep. Essentially what he's arguing is therefore not that wokeness is what is sleeping, but that wokeness, waking up, helps us stay asleep. Stay asleep to the structural underlying conditions by which in our very waking state, we refuse to see the reality or the ideology around us. Okay, that's super abstract, so let's break it down. Essentially, Žižek is using Freud's analysis of a father who has lost a son. This is the famous dream of the father whose son is burning. So imagine the scene. A father has lost his son. Son has died a premature death, and he is watching over the son's coffin. Now, the father falls asleep, and at a certain point, he has a dream in which his son is standing at his bedside and is grabbing him by the arm and saying, "Father, can't you see that I am burning?" At this point, the father wakes up to see that the candle has fallen over and that the coffin is beginning to burn. So what appears to be a symbol or a sign in his dream then suddenly appears like a kind of mystical prophecy about what's happening in the world. After all, the patient interprets this as, my son came back from the afterlife to send me a message that his coffin was burning. Now, Freud here has a very interesting argument. And in order to understand Freud's argument, you have to understand that the Freudian movement always functions like this. It's a two-step process. First, take what is in the dream very seriously. So a dream is worth analyzing. Secondly, undermine what appears to be the content of the dream by focusing on the repressed form of the dream. In other words, the content that lies within the form itself. Now, even though this is abstract, this is actually crucial, because Žižek, in his book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, Chapter 2, has a wonderful passage on how Freud is essentially doing the exact same thing that Marx did with the commodity fetish. Marx says that the analysis of the commodity fetish has to move in two steps. Step one, take an ordinary object, a commodity, and take it very seriously. Say it is worth analyzing. Like the dream, the commodity, like a shoe, is worth analyzing. Secondly, instead of focusing on the content of the commodity, focus on the repressed or the hidden content within the form itself. In other words, let's say you look at a Nike shoe. A Nike shoe is simply another shoe. But a Nike shoe promises you to be like your favorite athlete. In other words, what lies within the shoe is therefore not simply the value of the object, but the surplus value of the object, the abstract emanation that is the content that lies within the form, namely how the shoe is presented to you. Therefore, the surplus enjoyment, to go back to what we talked about before, implicit in the shoe is thereby precisely that when you wear the shoe, you feel, even though you know it's not true, you feel more athletic. You feel more like your favorite athlete because you are wearing the same shoe. And so what Marx does, and this is what Žižek argues in The Sublime Object of Ideology, what Marx does is analogous to what Freud does. First, you take the ordinary thing very seriously, too seriously. You interpret the dream, you interpret the commodity form. Then, instead of focusing on the implicit content of the dream or the form, you focus on the content that is hidden within the form. Now, for those of you who are interested in the critique of ideology, this is actually traditionally how the critique of ideology was philosophically explained, Ideologiekritik. Namely, the critique of ideology is never simply the insistence on content, what something is, or the form, how it appears. Instead, it is about the hidden content that lies within the form itself. That is the most technical definition of the critique of ideology, the hidden content that lies within the form itself. You could even see this on a political level, right? For example, the insistence that we focus on structural violence, or what Žižek calls the resistance of the hermeneutic temptation, is to say, let's not simply focus on a policeman beating an African American to death, which is easily then dismissed as an excessive outburst of irrational violence. Let's instead look at these structural, invisible ways in which such violence is permeated on a daily basis through ways that are not even considered violent in the first place, whether it's denying people loans or evicting people from their homes, that therefore structural racism is what we should be focusing on, not the explicit explosions of racism that we see in the street, although of course they are connected. That is the basic move of the critique of ideology, which is to say, let's not focus on the explosive content, the excessive feature. Instead, let's focus on the content that is hidden within the form. In other words, the racism that is hidden within structural injustices on a daily basis. The same can be said, for example, for feminism and post-colonialism, that the post-Marxist gesture is thereby to focus not on the overt content of domination and exploitation, but on the hidden content within the persistent forms of domination and exploitation itself. This also goes back to Marx's idea. Marx said that capitalism promises to make everybody free, to give everybody the access to the commodity market, that money is thereby supposed to be the great equalizer because it matters not if you're a king or a peasant, you can order the same shoes on Amazon, it doesn't matter. But Marx's argument is that false consciousness is the process by which within capitalism, this inequality between the peasant and the bondage between the lord and the peasant or the serf is maintained within capitalism, but now it is disavowed or repressed. In other words, now the content of exploitation, the system of domination and hierarchy persists, but it is made invisible. In other words, it is no longer the overt content of exploitation of the pre-capitalist society. It is now the latent content that is hidden within the form itself under the auspices of capitalist freedom of participation in the open market. Now let's go to Freud. Freud is saying the same thing. Freud is saying when we look at the dream, we should never look at the overt content of the dream. We should look at the latent dream work. In other words, the content hidden within the form itself. Finally, we can go back to the dream. The dream was, "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" The man wakes up, he sees that the son's coffin is on fire. Now, if we focus on the content of the dream, we think that the son was sending a message to the father in his sleep. But of course, that can't be true. We don't believe that dreams send us messages from the beyond like this. Freud is not a mysticist. Instead, Freud makes a much more interesting argument. He says, what is the repressed content within the form, namely the manner in which the dream occurs to you? Now we realize, and this is where Freud becomes like Sherlock Holmes, essentially, like he unlocks the mystery. The man felt guilty about not preventing his son's death. In other words, his guilt was repressed. He wakes up to see the coffin burning and retroactively believes that his son was sending him a message in his dream. In other words, the father stages himself as someone who has a second chance to be the hero through the call of the son, which is a way of repressing his original guilt. In other words, and here's the crucial part, he is waking up in order to stay asleep. He is waking up in order to keep repressing his guilt about not having prevented his son in the first place. And so thereby the very action by which he appears to be the savior of his son's coffin, receiving a mystical message from the boy from the beyond, is in fact an ulterior or secondary level of repression by which the man doesn't have to live up to his own guilt. Now you can see why Žižek uses this example and relates it to wokeness. He says, wokeness, which appears to us as the process by which we are saviors and we are called into agency to act on behalf of the other, is in fact the way in which we secretly are able to continue enjoying ourselves and we repress our original guilt that we are not in fact emancipatory revolutionary subjects. In other words, that we have done nothing to save them. And so wokeness is thereby the process for Žižek that mirrors the Freudian dream about the father who dreams of his son saying, "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" We waken up into a position of perceived radical agency, namely putting the fire out on the coffin. However, this very action serves to repress the underlying guilt that we know that we are ineffectual and that we have done nothing. That is Zizek's argument on wokeness, that wokeness is therefore not simply political correctness, but it is a minority position of the other by which moral superiority is affirmed that traps us within a loop of surplus enjoyment by which we repress any actual potential of radical agency on behalf of the other. That is Zizek's argument in this article, which he calls "Wokeness is Here to Stay." However, let me be very clear. That is not an easy or intuitive article. It just took me 45 minutes to try to begin explaining all the levels and layers of that argument. And so the question is, should Žižek have made these arguments in such a way? Should he have been essentially pushing all the buttons of the contemporary culture wars in a way that seems to the uninitiated reader to be closer to Jordan Peterson than to someone like, I don't know, like Slavoj Žižek? I think no. I think ultimately this article was, to my mind, framed in a way that was unhelpful and perhaps even in poor taste, although we shouldn't expect tastefulness to be one of Žižek's hallmarks, and thankfully so. I hope that for those of you who are interested in philosophy and theory, nevertheless, this article and the interest and the controversy that it has sparked will actually lead you into these ideas rather than lead you running into the open arms of reactionary forces. However, that is up to you. This has been my attempt to analyze the article, to take it step by step. I can post a link to YouTube and Instagram. The article is called "Wokeness is Here to Stay" in Compact by Slavoj Žižek. Highly controversial. You should read it. I highly encourage you to take a look at it. Make of it what you will. I'm curious what you think. This has been my attempt to analyze some of the key arguments made within this article. I want to say thank you for starting your week with me in like-minded philosophical and analytical theoretical fashion. I really do hope that you'll consider becoming a patron because it helps enormously to keep this project funded. I am 100% patron funded. This is an open access educational channel. I truly believe that education should be free. I love sharing these ideas with you every week. It is my passion, my project. Hopefully it will be my life's work. I'm so grateful to you. And if you'd like to download all of my lectures and all of my seminars, plus the Q&A, which I'm going to host right after this, please do consider becoming a patron. Every single bit helps. You can download this lecture on Patreon by going to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. I'll post the link. Until next week, thank you guys so much. Bye-bye.